That is a parent function that's being multiplied by some negative constant. So we know that we can conclude two things about our transformation. One, there's going to be a reflection across the x-axis because our outputs are being multiplied by a negative number. And two, there's going to be a vertical stretch because our outputs are being multiplied by a constant number that has an absolute value that's greater than 1. So our input and output, x and y, is going to be transformed to x and negative 2y. So to graph this, let's start by graphing our parent function. So the absolute value function looks like this. That means our reflection across, after a reflection across the x-axis, it'll look like this. And after a vertical stretch, it'll look like this. Okay? And so this is our function graph. Because all of our inputs and outputs, x and y, are being transformed to x and negative 2y. So if this were 1, 1, it would now be 1, negative 2. So now that we have our graph, let's go ahead and identify any intercepts. So we know there's two types of intercepts. There's an x-intercept and there's a y-intercept. And an x-intercept is where the graph crosses or touches the x-axis. And a y-intercept is where the graph crosses or touches the y-axis. So if we inspect our graph, we see that our graph only touches the axes once, and that's at the origin. And since the origin is the intersection of the x and y axis, that's a x-intercept and a y-intercept. So we have our x-intercept at the origin and our y-intercept at the origin. Now let's state our domain and range. So since the domain is the set of all input values, we can state our domain in interval notation by inspecting our graph and identifying the lowest input value and the highest input value. So if we inspect our graph, we see that we have an arrow here. So there is no lowest input value. Our inputs go all the way to negative infinity. And we have another arrow that points to positive infinity. So there is no highest input value. So our domain is all real numbers. And since the range is the set of all output values, to state it in interval notation, we can inspect our graph and identify the lowest output value and the highest output value. And when we do that, again, we see we have arrows, so there is no lowest output value. Our outputs go all the way to negative infinity. So our range is from negative infinity to our highest output, which is at 0. And we use a square bracket there because 0 is included in our range.